everyone. Good morning. Good to see you all. Keith from the Faculty Development Team in the Education Department. Welcome to the 2013-14 season of Primetime at the BU Library. Primetime celebrates learning beyond the classroom through the experiences and accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff, and it's a collaborative project between the Friends of the BU Library, Faculty Development, and many other offices on campus. If you'd like to see what's coming up at Primetime, you can check out the homepage of the new library website, where our upcoming events are listed. And if you've missed one, most are recorded and can be viewed online in our BU Digital Library. Coming up on Thursday, November 7th, Dr. Phyllis Alsdorf shares from her chapter in the forthcoming book, Whole and Holy Person, edited by Dr. Chris Garrett, entitled The Quest for an Evangelical University, Carl F. H. Henry and Carl H. Lumps. Today, we welcome Dr. Ray VanArragon as he presents intellectual virtue and the Adventurous Christ follower, also a chapter in Chris's book. Ray will explore some intellectual virtues that can offset the risk that comes with adventure. Let's welcome Ray this morning.
All right, thanks. I should say, by way of introduction, that yes, this is going to be a chapter in the book that Chris Garrett is putting together. This is also not ready for prime time. This is my first draft. I'm not going to read. I'm going to read parts of it, but not the whole thing. And I will try to keep to half an hour. So, okay. Intellectual virtue in the Adventurous Christ follower. Let me start with some comments about pietism. So pietism is well known for its emphasis on Christian experience and practice. And by the way, I'll have these slides up, and they're extremely busy. And I'm also going to, I'll talk about most of the things. I'm going to use it as a guide some of the time. So, assuming this will come forward. This is not advancing. That is a problem. Oh, there it is. Okay. Is that right? Yeah, that'll work. Okay. That's the first slide. Second. Pietism is well known for its emphasis on Christian experience and practice. A pietist does not wish to be an armchair Christian, a Christian with a finely tuned set of theological views which do not have any significant impact on the way she lives her life. In fact, the pietist thinks the impact of one's Christian faith should be significant. Armchair faith is no faith at all. At Bethel University, this emphasis on active faith is often captured in the call to be adventurous Christ followers. Adventurous, of course, goes beyond mere activity. It smacks of daring and danger. And so the phrase adventurous Christ follower calls to mind a person who makes a daring career choice, serving in a non-profit organization in some far-flung part of the globe, or starting a new business with some overtly Christian emphasis. Peril and danger lurk. These adventures can end in failure and even disaster. Nonetheless, an adventurous Christ follower takes risks, follows where the Spirit appears to lead, and more generally, with life choices, puts concern for security and comfort somewhere behind concern for following God's direction. But these are not the only kind of adventures that an active Christian, a pietist, will engage in. Christ followers will also encounter intellectual adventure in universities and beyond, and these adventures bring their own dangers. So in this essay, I want to explore some intellectual virtues, some of the dangers, some of the intellectual virtues and vices that adventurous pietists could be prone to. So I'll start by talking a little bit about virtues and vices themselves. Oh, working assumption. Now I'll explain why as I go along this assumption. Well, I'll explain briefly why this assumption is important. So the working assumption is that the essentials of the Christian faith are true. So the sort of thing that's captured in the Apostles' Creed. God exists in His creator of the heavens and the earth. God's a Trinity. God became incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ about 2,000 years ago, and Christ's sacrificial life and death make possible our salvation. Now, I'm making that assumption because if it's intellectual, what intellectual virtue is going to depend in part on what's true. So, if this is false, then it's not intellectually virtuous to believe it, right? So I'm assuming it's true, and that it is or can be intellectually virtuous to believe it. So that's the assumption in what I say until the end, when I'll revisit this assumption and discuss it a little bit more. So, talk a little bit about virtues For those of you who have read Aristotle, I think in CWC or Humanities or anything else, virtues are character traits or dispositions that aim at the good life. There's typically a mean between extremes. So you think about a virtue with respect to eating. That's a straightforward example. You can eat too little, you can eat too much, and you can eat the virtuous amount. And of course, the virtuous amount is going to depend on you, right? But at any rate, that general structure of a mean between extremes often applies to virtue. Not always, though. So moral virtue, we often think about moral virtues like generosity and patience and selflessness and so on. These kinds of moral virtues, moral virtue itself is defined because it aims at moral goods. Okay, we'll put it loosely. Aims at moral goods. We won't define, good of neighbor, justice, those sorts of things. Those are moral goods that moral virtue aims at. Intellectual virtue, on the other hand, is virtue that's aim is truth or knowledge or understanding or something along those lines. Intellectual goods. There's all sorts of complications there. And I think in my paper I can ignore most of them. So I'll do that here. But I'll just mention it may be that intellectual virtues are just a kind of moral virtue, since the truth is good, right? So intellectual virtue aims at the truth. Moral virtue aims at good. The truth is good. So intellectual virtue aims at moral good. In any case, there's much connection and overlap between the two. Some examples of intellectual virtues include studiousness, inquisitiveness, wisdom, careful reasoning. And maybe when you think about it, things like good vision and memory, those are intellectual virtues too, because they help you get to the truth, right? If you can see well, that helps you get to the truth. If you have a good memory, that helps you get to the truth. So we often think about, studiousness and all that as intellectually virtuous, but expanding the category, being able to see well, that's also intellectually virtuous. Okay, and you think about, so one of the things I was thinking about whether these virtues are means. You think about studiousness. The studiousness can be taken to an extreme, right? At least in some way. If you study and study and study all sorts of things, you might not be very good at living the good life. However, you may come to lots and lots of true beliefs. So there's questions here about whether what's intellectually virtuous can sometimes be morally not so. So moral virtue needs to check intellectual virtue so that a person doesn't study too much, for example, and because studying too much can prevent you from living a good human life. But okay. Anyway, all sorts of complications, but you get the idea. Now, so I want to talk about two intellectual virtues, and especially about the vices that are opposed to them that I think Pietists may be inclined to fall for. So, let me find the parts of my paper that I've just skipped over, and I'll go to this. Okay, I'll just talk off of this one. So, appropriate concern for the truth. So, there is extremes here. There's being too concerned with certain kinds of truth, like obsessive trivia collecting. So there would be something intellectually vicious, probably morally vicious, if I spent all my days studying baseball statistics and committing them to memory, or the phone book, for example. I'd know lots of truths then, but there's something wrong about that. So, so that's an extreme, that's somehow a vicious concern for the truth. But then you can also get too little concern for the truth, where you think, for example, that there is no such thing, or if you just don't care about it. And so my suggestion that I'll explore here in a minute is that the pietist tendency goes in the latter direction on matters of Christian faith. If there's a vice in this area towards which pietists might lean, it would be in the latter direction, not enough concern for the truth. And so what I'm going to do is explain a little bit, draw out a little bit how that can happen. So some examples of quotes. Chris Garrett says that pietists emphasize the importance of a heart transformed by the experience of conversion and regeneration, and hence do not attach special importance to the examination of philosophical presuppositions and theological propositions. Janelle Williams Paris These are both from articles in Christian Scholars Review. For Pietists, faith is heartfelt, experiential, and not heavily doctrinal. Faith is a way of life, not an ideology or set of control beliefs. Now, I'm not disagreeing with any of this, but you can still see how this sort of inclination can lean in a certain direction when it comes to concern for truth with respect to Christian belief. Okay. And Mark Knoll, who's a historian now at Notre Dame, wrote this famous book, Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And he says that Pietism has been guilty of just that, historically. So here's a quote he has. He's talking about second and third generation Pietists after Spener and others. The intellectual problem of Pietism lay in its excesses. Pietists had rediscovered the truth that Christianity is a life as well as a set of beliefs. The difficulty arose when some Pietists began to view Christian life as only a life without a concern for beliefs at all. This led into fascination with practice, deep involvement in spiritual experience, and absorption in the psychological dimensions of the faith. Objective realities of revelation were sometimes almost totally eclipsed. At its extreme, the Pietist emphasis on religious life gave very little attention to self-conscious Christian thought. So, he goes on to say, to describe Pietism's link with theological liberalism in the 19th century. He puts some of the blame for theological liberalism on Pietism. Okay, so now this part I'm going to read. So I say it roughly the way I intend to. Now, I've labeled lack of concern for the truth as an intellectual vice, and Pietists may tend towards it with respect to Christian belief insofar as they more strongly emphasize experience and practice. We should note, however, that there are contexts in which concern for the truth quite properly does not take center stage, or at any rate where the tendency not to emphasize it is altogether understandable. I'm thinking in particular of engagements with people with whom we disagree on religious matters, atheists and people of other faiths. And I think I can move this forward here. Here we go. Okay, so I have the points up here, but I'm going to read how I wrote it here. In general, when we maintain friendships with people with whom we disagree, the fact of our disagreement and the truth of the matter is not something we tend to focus on. Much of this tendency can stem from moral virtue. We love the friend and wish her good. But then it can be painful to think that she's mistaken about something really important. In addition, it can seem wrong somehow to think of that person as lacking something significant that you have. In an important sense, friendship is a relationship between equals, and focusing on this perceived lack in the friend can create an obstacle to that sort of equality. Finally, concerns about propriety can prevent one from discussing or calling any kind of serious attention to the disagreement. Adventurous Pietists emphasize active love and building relationships with religious others and people with whom they disagree, and that in itself is altogether praiseworthy. My concern is that the kind of stance that de-emphasizes disagreement, a stance entirely natural to loving relationships, can slide into the tendency to think that the truth about the matter on which you disagree is unimportant. Love of the other can lead to a lack of concern for the truth. So there's the way I put it. I'm not saying this will happen to our adventurous pietists, only that it can, and that a focus on experience and action rather than belief, together with the adventurous spirit that leads our Christ follower into a deep and profound engagement with others, can incline her towards this particular intellectual vice. Not an extreme version of it, but just not caring about whether the essentials of Christian faith are true and just sort of forgetting about it. Okay, that's virtue number one, and its related vice. The second kind of virtue I want to talk about is open-mindedness. And notice I say appropriate open-mindedness, because open-mindedness is not always virtuous. So extremes. Excessive dogmatism, the kind of person who won't be swayed about anything. And then on the other hand, you get a person who changes with every wind, right? I was thinking, I don't know if any of you know Alistair McIntyre. That guy's changed all over the place over his career. I'm not accusing him of excessive open-mindedness. He's a brilliant man. But it's still kind of peculiar that he's gone so far. swayed in such different directions. Okay, and so the virtue, appropriate open-mindedness, is somewhere in between. Now where? That's very hard to say. Okay, so as I say here, there's varieties of open-mindedness. There's open-mindedness with respect to beliefs you already hold. So you hold Christian beliefs, the obvious example we're talking about here. You can be open-minded about it, as in consider opposing views, reassess your own belief, those sorts of things. Or political beliefs. You can be open-minded with respect to the political beliefs you already have. You can also be open-minded with respect to issues that you haven't taken a stand on. So you don't know who to vote for in the mayoral election for Minneapolis, which apparently is going on today. You don't have a clue who any of these people are. Well, you can be open-minded as in you want to objectively consider who's the best candidate for this. So there's other kinds of open-mindedness that I may end up talking about in the paper, but the kind of open-mindedness that doesn't necessarily seek to believe or think of taking on someone else's beliefs, but the kind of open-mindedness that involves trying to understand where they're coming from. Okay, and that's a virtuous kind of, that can be a virtuous kind of open-mindedness too, even if it doesn't involve any temptation toward believing what they do. So in this, I borrowed partially and added my own thing from a book by a guy named, a philosopher named Jason Bayer. An open-minded person is appropriately willing and able to set aside or transcend her own beliefs in order to give a fair and impartial hearing to an opposing view where her own beliefs are appropriately impacted as a result. So it may result in you believing it less firmly what you started with. It may result in no change at all. That could be perfectly virtuous. Or it could result in you giving it up and changing your mind or something to that effect. Okay, so open-mindedness. It's emphasized by Pietists, including Christian Collins Wynne, who's, I believe, in South Korea right now. So I should misrepresent him really badly. So he emphasizes, this was in a talk he gave at faculty retreat a couple of years back. He emphasizes the Irenic spirit of the Pietist. The Pietist is a sincere arguer who enters dialogue with a genuine openness to being taught. Now, one point is, are they open to being taught on everything? Are there any things that Adventurous Pietist is not open to being taught about? So the obvious point is that, so what is appropriate and virtuous open-mindedness? The obvious point is that a virtuous open-minded person is not necessarily open about everything, right? You have moral beliefs, I hope, that you're not particularly open-minded about, and that's perfectly okay. And it's so you might say, why? You might also not be particularly open-minded to the suggestion that you're in the Matrix right now. So you've all seen the Matrix, the movie The Matrix, according to which what you're being fed is actually a computer program, and you're in a vat somewhere being used as a battery. Well, that probably, you're not too open-minded to that possibility, and properly so, right? It's nuts. Okay. So the question is, why not? Like in the case of beliefs about your ordinary surroundings, and also straightforward moral beliefs that, discrimination of various kinds, are just wrong. I mean, you're not going to be talked out of that, and you're not going to listen to anyone who tries to. So why not? It's a difficult question. So why is it virtuous not to be open-minded with respect to those beliefs, not to be unwilling to set those beliefs aside? That's a difficult question, but the purely intellectual side of the answer is that the beliefs are true, and the cognitive faculties that produce them are trustworthy. Your vision and your senses and so on are reliable. Likewise for your moral sense. So it would be actually intellectually vicious of you. I mean, it would go against your intellectual goal of truth and knowledge and understanding for you to give up those beliefs. It's perfectly virtuous for you not to. So, Karl Lundquist says the same thing, of course, about some Christian beliefs. He's former president of Bethel, as you probably know. Says this in a sermon from the 1950s. By the way, Chris Gertz, who can't be here today, you know, you write a paper on pietism and you say to Chris, I need a quote about this. And he comes up with a quote about this. So here's a quote about this. We need to be mindful in our search for truth that our Savior has set some limits, says President Lundquist. There also is no virtue in having an open mind toward that which God has closed. Okay, so this is something Carl Lundquist thought. I want to give an example of a person who I think wasn't a pietist, but he wouldn't have called himself a pietist, I don't think. But his name is John Hick. I don't know if any of you have heard of John Hick. Some of you have, but I taught about him in class. Okay. To see how an adventurous pietist might miss out on the virtue and become overly open-minded, consider the story of John Hick, a British philosopher whose views in philosophy of religion have been highly influential. Hick was raised a Christian but gave up Christian beliefs, a process he has described in a story of his religious development. He describes how, as a young professor at the University of Birmingham in England, he lived in a community with many represented religious groups, and he became involved in a number of community relations organizations. Those organizations had foes, so this was in the 50s and 60s, including the neo-Nazi National Front, a group of racist thugs who threatened Hick and assaulted some of his friends. As Hick reports, in all this, through all this chaos, I found myself in active comradeship with Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, Marxists, and humanists, as well as with fellow Christians. That was the context for his eventual epiphany, and here is the epiphany, which I will read. In the course of this interfaith work, this relationship building among these communities, I went frequently to Jewish synagogues, Muslim mosques, Sikh gurudwaras, Hindu temples, and of course a variety of churches. In these places of worship, I soon realized something that is obvious enough once noticed, yet momentous in its implication, which is misspelled. This is that although the language, concepts, liturgical action, and cultural ethos differ widely from one another, yet from a religious point of view, basically the same thing is going on in all of them. Namely, human beings coming together within a framework of an ancient and highly developed tradition to open their hearts and minds to God, whom they believe makes a total claim on their lives and demands of them, in the words of one of the prophets, to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. So he comes to think through these experiences that all religions are essentially the same. Okay, we're all doing the same thing. So the position he came to, and the position he held to with amendments for the rest of his life, was that there is this one ultimate divine reality which is beyond all human conception, to which all major world religions are culturally conditioned responses. Differences between religions, he argued, are only surface deep. At their heart, the religions are fundamentally the same. So I'm just going to keep reading this part. Now, Hick was not a pietist, at least not by description, but his engagement with the world fits well with what we might ask from an adventurous Christ follower. He was an active Christian, something of a pioneer in interfaith relations. And yet a certain kind of open-mindedness led him away from Christianity to a position that sees all religions as importantly equal. Much of this open-mindedness stemmed from moral virtue. He was by all accounts a wonderfully kind and generous man, and his interfaith engagement is undoubtedly praiseworthy. Furthermore, his feeling of solidarity with religious others, generated in part by the opposition of bigots, is both understandable and laudable. Still, his open-mindedness crossed to the level of intellectual vice and led him to reject Christian belief and, as many critics have pointed out, overlook vast differences between religions in order to portray them all as fundamentally the same. So, all right. So, and I say here, and by the way, this word intellectually vicious makes it sound like it's really, really terrible. But it's just vice, okay? It's intellectual vice. And there's intellectual vices on all. Not all intellectual vices are equally bad. So I know I had my dad read this, and he read the word vicious, and it kind of jolted him. Okay. But what makes Hick's intellectual, his open-mindedness intellectually vicious? Well, it prevented him from seeing difference where it is. It inclined him to see all religions as fundamentally the same when I think that they're not. And it also led him away from true belief. Remember, we're working on the assumption that Christian belief is true, and these habits of his, these inclinations of his led him away from that. Okay, so I'll check the time and then read the next paragraph. Okay. We are considering intellectual dangers that an adventurous pietist may face. My suggestion here is that the pietistic emphasis on Christian life and experience may incline a person towards a non-virtuous degree of open-mindedness. If Christianity is mainly about opening one's heart to God, as John Hick thought it was, and members of other religious groups are by all appearances similarly open, well, maybe our religions are all fundamentally the same. Focus on Christian practice to the neglect of belief can lead to setting aside the belief too easily, and can lead a person too quickly to adopt a belief system that may preserve the practice but leave it without a foundation. That's one of the criticisms of Hick. I mean, if this ultimate divine reality is something completely beyond our conceptions, why should it motivate us to do anything, right? I mean, there's something missing in this sort of in this sort of religious picture that he's left with. In addition, the kind of profound engagement with those with whom we disagree, which arouses feelings of camaraderie and equality that can lead to a lack of concern about the truth on the matter of disagreement, can also make a view that puts all religions on equal footing seem attractive, and the result can be a full-blooded loss of Christian faith. So, what to do? Let's see. Revisiting our assumption. This is kind of important. So you can't see it either. Revisiting our assumption, it says across the top. What if Christian belief is not true? Then straightforward answer, holding it isn't intellectually virtuous. It's understandable, but it doesn't get us in touch with the truth, right? Well, and why do we believe it? I should back up. I mean, if it is true, I think the source of it's God himself. Right? The source of it's the Holy Spirit. If it isn't true, then Freud or something along those lines is probably right. Christian belief stems from our need to cope, our need to get along in the world. So, and it may help do that, but it doesn't get us in touch with the truth. So, if holding it is, if it's false, then the previous examples I've given are intellectually virtuous, John Hick included, at least insofar as they disabuse the adventurous pietists who go in those directions of false belief. So how can we establish which it is? Is it virtuous or not virtuous? Well, it'd be really nice if we could prove it. I was going to find a book here. I mean, there's some people in this book, God is good, God is great. Some people who think we really can go a long way towards proving that Christianity is in fact true. For my part, and I think I speak with many pietists in having doubts about that project. But okay, so it's been important then that we're assuming that Christian belief is true. If it isn't, then what I've been labeling as intellectually non-virtuous may in fact be virtuous. Still, working from our conviction that Christian belief is true, what can adventurous Christ followers do to maintain intellectual virtue? And I have two non-original suggestions. I think if it were original, that would be bizarre. But, okay. One is the straightforward call to reading the Bible, right? Reading, keeping in touch that way, reminding yourself of these things. So read the Bible, read the creeds, read Christian classics. These are habits to develop, and I mean this for myself too, incidentally, that keep the truth of Christian belief in mind while a person lives the Christian life. So a quote from Spener here, calling us to read the Bible. Thought should be given to a more extensive use of the Word of God among us. We know that by nature we have no good in us. If there is to be any good in us, it must be brought about by God. To this end, the Word of God is the powerful means, since faith must be enkindled through the gospel, and the law provides the rules for good works and many wonderful impulses to attain them. The more at home the Word of God is among us, the more we shall bring about faith and its fruits. So notice for him, he's calling, he's speaking in a time where there's too much concern about the truth and not any action, right? So read the Bible. That will spur you to action. My suggestion is it can work the other way too. Read the Bible; it can keep you in touch with the truth. And then the next point that I think can help maintain virtue in this situation is to be aware of our intellectual situation. And why don't I quick read that? We recognize our intellectual position. As I say here, there's no position that's safe. There's no risk-free intellectual position, including John Hick's everyone is right position. When you stop and think about John Hick, who says that there's this, God, this divine reality, and all religions are appropriate responses to this divine reality, he is, in fact, saying that all religions are wrong. I mean, it doesn't sound that way. I mean, it sounds like we're all equal and we're all doing the same thing, and let's all hold hands and whatnot. But he's actually saying that everybody's wrong, except, of course, for him and his ilk, right? So it's not like you take some sort of privilege, you take some sort of position, and now you're not risking being wrong. You risk being wrong no matter what you believe, and you risk missing out on the truth if you don't believe anything. So disagreement, this kind of disagreement with people, is simply unavoidable, and it's important to recognize that, including in all sorts of disagreements: religious, philosophical, political, and otherwise. So, as I say at the end here, hopefully then a virtuous commitment to maintain connection with the truth, combined with an honest recognition of our human position with respect to it, can promote intellectual virtue and mitigate the dangers facing the adventurous Christ follower. Thanks. Okay, so any questions or comments? Yes, Sarah.
This might be in the part of the paper that you skipped over towards the beginning, but I'm wondering how you see the relationship between moral virtue and intellectual virtue, because there's a way of reading your conclusion that would put them hierarchically where sort of intellectual virtue trumps the moral virtue, but there are other parts of your paper where I see them as kind of a check and balance system between each other. And I think that, so I'm not sure which model goeth on your conclusion, because the question that kind of seems to be begged for me is, okay, if disagreement is simply unavoidable, how do we live in the midst of disagreement, which allows us to go back to moral virtue, versus disagreement is simply unavoidable, therefore we kind of have to break off some of our relationships, and that would make that a more hierarchical model.
And I wouldn't want that at all. I mean, I think interfaith engagement and going out into the world as we're called to do in all areas, I think that has to go on. I just think a recognition that disagreement is unavoidable, that has to be squared with full engagement with people with whom we disagree. Because you can see the inclination, like I say, when you're engaging with people you really disagree with, to ignore the disagreement and I don't know, become kind of soft on it. I don't mean that exactly, but the idea. Or to tell some kind of story where it turns out you're all right, or not, as John Hick would say. So yeah, I would definitely want to say that the two, intellectual virtue and moral virtue, have to work together. And part of moral virtue involves engaging with others, and intellectual virtue somehow has to be compatible with that. So that's what I think. Any other? Yeah, Dan.
I want to ask about the assumption that the Pietist emphasis on experience and practice and diminishing theological disagreements makes you more open-minded or more ironic. Because I can see instances where one person's practice becomes as either rigid or as doctrinaire as a theological dogmatism might be. Let me give you an example. Paul here likes to raise apples, and he's raising local apples on his land, and he really believes in local fruit. Okay, Carol, on the other hand, is a big farmer, and she wants to solve the problems of world hunger, and she's willing to introduce genetically modified organisms and so on. And they're both Christians, but because practice is so important to these pietists, Paul really believes that Carol's wrong, and there's something wrong with her Christian practice. That seems to me a problem with pietism generally. And if practice is exalted to the highest levels, we really don't have any more of a way of living together peacefully than the dogmatic people or the non-pietists do. You see the problem?
Yeah. No, I hadn't thought of that, but that's certainly true. Practice can be dogmatic. Now, and people can be convinced that their kind of practice is the right one, and argue with those who practice differently. Now, I'm not quite sure what to make of that, other than to note that yes, that is another kind of dogmatism that can infect the pietists. Do you have anything? I mean,
to me, I think it's a very big problem within pietism. I come from a Calvinist tradition. Calvin said truth is an order to goodness, which is a complicated way of saying truth comes first.
Yeah.
And it really is very difficult for me. I think it's a big problem with pietism. James Hurd has talked about shunning practices and how that gets worked out in more
Yeah.
So it's a problem for you guys to solve.
All right. Paul.
I haven't thought about this a lot, but I was just sort of struck at the beginning with the dichotomy between praxis and doctrine.
Yeah.
You had a couple quotations there from Chris and Janelle.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't in some way it's, when you really think about it, it's got to be a false dichotomy in some way. I mean, Janelle says we don't pay too much attention to control beliefs, but that's a doctrinal claim. I mean, that's an intellectual claim.
Yeah.
That I've made the choice that I'm not going to pay so much attention to control beliefs or something like that. I mean, that's an intellectual guide or a rider on things. So I say, I don't allow for this intellectually, but that's an intellectual claim, it seems to me. So at least you might maybe call it a second order claim or something like that. But it seems like we're all doing that on either side, and then we're also making claims on the other side about how significant our practice is. Do I have some doctrine about practices or not, or whatever. So I mean, it seems to me it's hard to get rid of one side or the other, or to say I'm really emphasizing one side or the other. As soon as I say that, I'm making an intellectual claim that these intellectual claims are not so important.
Yeah.
Or something like that. That's an intellectual.
I think that's right. And I mean, Janelle, writes an article. It's written with all sorts of claims made, and many of them are true, no doubt. But yeah, the claims are not being ignored. They're definitely being made in service of certain kinds of practice. Yeah, I mean, my focus here is just on the central claims of Christian faith, and what's the position being held with respect to this.
I just want to add one other thing. I came today because I've never thought of you as a pietist. I don't know what you're doing, writing a chapter.
Pietism is a very big tent. All right, any other questions?
Have you ever read the Bible?
Yes.
It's okay. I asked him to come here and teach.
Yeah. Yes, I have. But in the hustle and bustle of life, we can fall off that habit. That's a habit that I think is valuable in many ways. Yes.
No, I'm just thinking of putting it in a student's perspective about the idea of practice, and I think how it leads to judgment. I had a student last week tell me she's thinking of leaving Bethel. She's a freshman because one of the reasons, there are multiple, people are so judgmental here. And I thought it can be that way, and other people are experiencing something very different. And your ideas are worth weaving into instruction about finding balance.
Well, and I think what Dan said too. I mean, I don't know what kind of judgmentalness that your student was referring to. If it's you know, doctrine related, or if it's practice related. But it could be, you know, it could be that. Right? I don't know if people who, you know, people who don't like the style of worship in chapel, if they feel sort of out of place at Bethel. I don't know, but it could happen. So yeah, like Dan said, I mean, dogmatism can take many forms. Okay. Thank you very much, and I have a test to give right now. So this is perfect timing.